It's been a week now, and day 7 will be focused on the most critical aspect of any story: relationships. Now, relationships are defined by 3 main dimensions. There's a 4th one, which is alignment, which will be treated in a later part of the course. For now, the 3 main dimensions mending relationships will be affinity, functions, and rules. Let's start to put the emphasis on the difference between function and rule with this course. The function and rules principle apply to characters, environments, and items. When it comes to environment and items, if they were man-made, all these will have a function as it is intended by their builder, and their role in the long run will evolve. So the function in most cases is more rigid than the role, and this applies to characters as well. Whereas the role, not only can it change, but it can change according to scenarios, according to situation that the initial builder, the initial thinker haven't been able to anticipate. So when it comes to characters now, function is what will define what the character is supposed to do, whereas role defines what the character is likely to do. It's a little bit more difficult here, and we're gonna start to think in terms of probabilities, not in terms of pure determinism and causality. Because when a character is put in a situation where she has to react, she has, as defined previously, 3 main means of reaction. She can fight, she can try to negotiate or reason, or she can flee. These are the 3 main type of reactions. And by main type, we mean you can combine them. You can imagine a fight plus negotiate situation, which would be a coercion. You can imagine a negotiation which can evolve into a flee. And you can imagine a fight and flee situation where the character isn't sure if she can defeat her opponent. So, function and role when it comes to character will need this probabilistic approach in the short term, since character evolve in a general sense faster than environments and objects. But function and roles are just as useful for characters as they are for environments and settings, as well as objects. And because we consider that an organization is potentially a setting or an object, the same goes for an organization. Affinity is the simplest of these terms to study, and will be linked to a subject treated further, which will be alignments. But affinity is the simple part, the simple component of this bigger structure, which will be the outer collective structure, where you combine affinities plus alignment. You will have a better understanding of what a character is supposed to do, or what she thinks she's supposed to do for her team, for her organization, for her nation. We kept this course for the end of the week so that you had the opportunity to mature your vision on your story. Because we think a week is enough to develop your plan fully, to develop your one-pager fully. So now you should have a clear idea of what the story should be, how it should start, how it should end, who are your 4 main characters, or even up to 6 if you have more than 4, and how they will interact. We keep this course for the end of the week because relationships is the crux of your story. Relationships will allow you to create attachment between characters, and it will allow you to create attachment between the characters and the public. And this is your ultimate goal. Creating attachment, creating belonging, creating familiarity, creating the wish to return to your stories, the want to be part of these stories, this emerging feeling from the public. That's your final goal. Oh no. The affinity system is a 4-part quadrant. Here you can see displayed the 4 main types of affinity-based relationships and the transition between them. Transition from friend to ally, from ally to opponent, from opponent to foe, from foe to friend. You can consider this cycle, clockwise. You can consider that any character in a story which is long enough can have any of these 4 affinities with any other characters, and depending on how you want to articulate the relationship between these 2 characters, they can share symmetrically. They can resent each other. They can want to be with each other. At any stage of the story, again, if the story is long enough, because emotional attachment takes time relative to your story structure, they can occupy each of these affinity-based relationships. The quadrant is separated by 2 axes. In abscissa, we have an appreciation axis, whereas in ordinate, we have a time-based or sustainability axis. From left to right, the appreciation increases, whereas from bottom to top, the time frame increases. Remember, emotional attachment requires time. This time is determined relative to the scale of your story, whether the scale is world-based or time-based. In the top right corner, we got friend, which is at maximum appreciation and maximum desire to establish a sustainable relationship. A friend is linked to another friend by their goal. If you remember the course on allies and how you create supporters, you remember that friends are linked by their goal, they're linked by their interest, wherever it is an interest which is based on an activity or on a person. You can add a third keyword here. The goal of 2 friends may also be a destination. No. The goal of 2 friends may also be a destination. So it can be a person, can be an activity or a skill, and it can be a destination. That's what link 2 friends here. In the bottom right corner, we get allies. Allies tend to be in the maximum or at least moderate appreciation corner, but are not linked to your party and to your protagonist for a long time. Allies are not meant to be long-term relationships. They can be if the depth factor, if the attachment factor between allies and your character and your team is enhanced through time, and then an ally can transition to a friend. But generally speaking, allies are short-term relationships. Your protagonist and her team will ally herself to other character to solve a specific issue. And there is still a matter of mild competition. When you ally with a character, the trust has not been fully established. Depth, appreciation, and emotional attachment or the pursuit of the same goal are essential if you want to turn an ally into a friend, if you want to make this short-term relationship, this situational relationship, into a sustainable, structural relationship. In bottom left, we got the opponent type affinity. Now, opponent, just like allies, are short-term relationships. You aren't meant to keep an opponent for a long term. And generally, an opponent is also a situational relationship. You're opposing a character on a specific topic, on a specific matter, or again, in a specific issue where you can't collaborate or you want to compete. And competition is the transitive factor between allies and opponents. If at some point an ally identifies the protagonist, if at some point an ally identifies you as a menace, as a threat, they will be in a competition situation. Now, it can allow you to transition an ally to an opponent factor, to an opponent state. But the opposition is more likely to transit to foe. And there, the factor here is comparable, you just transit from being seen as a potential threat to be an effective threat, For competition, when it comes to competing, you're just a potential threat, whereas in the case of the hindrance, you became an effective threat. And that's really what makes the difference. The same time. If you want to compare ally to friends, in the case of an alliance, the relationship is just established, whereas with a friend, the relationship has been established and wants to be made sustainable by both sides. Same thing for foes. Now, the transition between opponent and foe may appear to be the most obvious, whereas it is, but only in the logic that we've used just up to this moment. Remember that here we're using a clockwise logic, so a friend can become an ally can become an opponent can become a foe, and a foe can become a friend. And that's this clockwise cycle that we'll be using for most of the course because it's the simplest structure and it ensures you to end your project in the simplest and clearest manner. But it's absolutely not the only possibility. Opponent can transition to friend, foe can transition to ally, and so on. Because each affinity-based change is situational. It's almost always situational, except when it comes to the transition between foe and friend, and we'll see that just afterwards. Now, an opponent can transit to a foe if the opponent has identified the protagonist, you, as an effective threat or a hindrance. Now you've been identified to an hindrance. The opponent will think about your goal in more details. You opposed them in this due situation, on this due topic, but they may think, okay, but this person is a potential danger in this situation. In which other situation would she be considered a danger? And she may ask you about your goal and what you're doing, or observe you and suppose what your goal is. Well, if she establishes that you are not only opposed on a specific topic, but you will be opposed in most topics, in most situations, because your goal are opposite or your goal are aligned, but you're in a very high stake of competition, she will likely, against a probabilistic frame of mind, she will likely turn into a foe. And a foe, which was an opponent before, is more likely to remain a foe, where a foe which was an ally before can return to the ally state again, or can become a friend. Depends on the situation, but really, a foe which was an opponent is likely to be a foe who has thought a lot about your goal. She has faced you multiple times on multiple topics, and now her mind has rigidified around the idea where you're a threat for her. Now for the last transition, I'd like you to watch this image where the two avatars we're using here to guide you through this course are intertwined. The avatars are overlapping each other, and that's a deliberate part of the course. I want you to consider that a foe and a friend could be close kind of characters in a lot of situations. There are some situations where a foe is a foe and it's definitive. And then a foe will transit to something else we call a menace later, but it's not exactly the same menace we're using since the beginning. But it's the same idea. Most foe, and there's a tendency for you, there's an opportunity for you as a writer, as an author, as a character creator, to develop your empathy if you're able to understand the transition between foe and friend here, and the overlap, the potential intertwining between those two affinity states. Because these two states are potentially overlapping. And you'll see that the antagonist you enjoy the most, you will classify them into this permeable category, transition between foe and friend. So how do you transit from a foe to a friend? How does a foe appear in the first place? If your protagonist develops a new foe, I mean, this character was not an ally before, this character was not a friend before, and this character was not an opponent before. A new foe. Or more accurately, this character was not an ally or not an opponent before. May have been a friend. A new foe will be opposed on your party, on your team, on an ideal basis. The foe will identify herself as a foe because your goals are opposed in terms of ideal, not necessarily in terms of execution. In fact, you may be competing in terms of execution, but the ideal, the end goal, is opposite. If you have to use the same resources, if you have to acquire the same stats, the same position, you will not use them in the same manner. So a new foe will oppose you on an ideal basis. Now, how do you transition from foe to friend? Again, you transition from foe to friend on an ideal basis. You become a foe to someone. Again, in most cases, because there is a group of foe, and this group, we'll call them the fiends for now. There is a group of foe which will it's not possible. You can't transit back into a friend, or you can become friend with them. It's impossible. But it's one group of foe. It's one group of antagonists, and we'll keep them aside for now because this course is supposed to help also children, authors to write children's stories. I want everyone to be able to listen to it. So we'll keep this kind of opponent for a later course, a more advanced course or a more mature course. We'll not discuss this type of opponent for now. As a matter of fact, we'll not discuss much horror in this course. If you're planning to write horror, most of what I'm saying right now, you apply it. But the gruesome part of horror, I'm not gonna treat it here. So if you want that, please leave a comment, leave multiple comments, leave them in every video. Let's say, I want a mature course, I want a gore course, I want a more violent course. You just tell it in the comment. Like the videos and subscribe. But this other course or this other set of video, we'll keep it for later. So what I'm saying right now does not fully apply to horror. It does not fully apply to action in some cases, because it applies to most of action, because action is not that gruesome, really. Action is not that intense most of the time. It's not that fearsome, it's not that disgusting. Really, that's more the horror territory, and that's more the drama territory to some extent. But what we're saying now is, to some extent, PG. We're not giving you advice that would not be applicable to children's story or stories written by children. So if you're a child and if you're a teenager and if you're listening to this course, tell us too in the comment section, and understand that this course is absolutely applicable for you. It's not an adult-based course, it's a grown-up course, to be precise. It's a universal course, really, on this matter. Okay, all that I just said, it applies only to antagonists, okay? Because for the rest, you can consider that you use this for any genre. Foes here. Foes will be prevalent. Foes will be prevalent. They're essential. Foes will be threats, and foes will be menaces. And foes can turn into team member, they can turn into supporter. We'll see function just after that. So I want to create the transition here. A foe can become a supporter. A foe can become the best friend of the main character. A foe can become the lover of the main character. Because we're treating this kind of foe. We're not treating fiends here. So, foes and friends. And we'd recommend that in your early stories, for example, your 4 first stories, you try this in one story at least. A character is a foe in chapter 1 to 2. Chapter 3 to 4, it becomes a friend, becomes a foe again on chapter 5 to 6, and after chapter 6, become a definitive friend of the main character. A close friend of the main character, a lover even, You want to experience this deep relationship, because that's maybe the deepest relationship you'll have here, the closest relationship. So we'll apply that, keep that in mind. You want to develop a gorgeous antagonist, and we'll develop the theme gorgeous later, but keep that in mind. When I say the deepest relationship, I'll be talking about the relationship between a loving foe and the main character, an attached foe and the main character, because I'm gonna talk about it again in the function part and in the roles part. Function is the most common characterization when it comes to creating individuals for your story. Function as a classification system allows you to turn your individual character into part of a collective. It's the simplest way to create protagonists, antagonists, and support. And you may be highly familiar with these 3 terms, even if you haven't started to write story. Because even as a public, even as a viewer, you've already heard these terms a lot in critics, in analysis. Now, let's figure out, you want to experience the protagonist's creation, the antagonist's creation, and the support's creation. How does it translate? Well, it's all a matter of perspective. Most of the time, the protagonist's perspective will be the main perspective. That's why the protagonist is often considered to be the main character, which is inaccurate here, because main character refers to all essential characters of the story. Therefore, the protagonist's supports main supports. And antagonists are all main characters since they are all essential to the story. If you remove the antagonist, there is no protagonist to some extent. If you remove the support, the protagonist can still continue her journey, but it will be more difficult. So all three of them are main characters, but the protagonist has the main perspective. Now, how does it translate in terms of point of view? Establishing that the protagonist has the main point of view will generally translate into a number of page or an amount of screen time. So most of the time you spend as a public, as a viewer, as a reader, will be with the protagonist and will be through the protagonist's perspective. So it will generally translate into at least half of the story, the minimum, or even 2/3 of the story, depending on the balance you're trying to establish. The support here will be second to the protagonist, or even tertiary if you consider that the secondary perspective belongs to the antagonist. But the support should be quite close to the protagonist since it's another main character. How does a supporter act? Well, a supporter can oppose the protagonist if it's a rival. It can entice the protagonist if it's an enticer. She can advise the protagonist if she's an advisor. And she can allow the protagonist to ponder more if she's an arbiter. Now, the support's role, if you consider the 4 roles that we mentioned here, so rival, enticer, advisor, and arbiter, is not defined by our function. The support's role is not defined by our function, just like the protagonist's role is not defined by our function, and so on. So if a character is a support, she can perfectly be any of these 4 roles that we will treat in further details just after this. The antagonist, which we will call the threat for most of this course, because here we are treating one main kind of antagonist, which will be the threat. The antagonist here may share an amount of time, an amount of screen time, an amount of pages consequential to what the protagonist already possesses. So in another way, the antagonist may have nearly as much screen time as the protagonist if it's your choice. If you want to challenge yourself, really, give them something like 40-40 for each. 40% for the protagonist and 40% for the antagonist, and the rest for the support. 20% for the support. So, but if you want to follow general frame, you give most of the perspective to the protagonist, something like 90%, and 10% for the support, and the rest will be really explained at the end, so namely the threat's motivation, but only through the protagonist's point of view. That's the general way, that's the general path to follow. Now, if you want to challenge yourself, you can really go for something like 50% for the protagonist, 30% for the antagonist, and 20% for the support, or 40-40-20. You do the splits. You will do the splits, but consider that even if the antagonist's thoughts, even if the antagonist's thought process is not clearly written, you'll have to be able to guess it through the protagonist's perspective. Now, all these rules apply for threat, clearly identified threats, identified by both the protagonist and the support. Now, a support here is not supposed to be supporting exclusively the protagonist. A supporter, and that's That's not necessarily one character of the story. It can be multiple characters. Supporter will align herself with the protagonists or the antagonists of your story and become part of their group. So, creating a supporter, a protagonist supporter or an antagonist supporter does not differ much, except in what the supporter is allowed to do by your team, either the protagonist's team or the antagonist's team, and that's where the alignment factor will become prevalent. The last function, or the first function, is the menace. Now, the menace is presented as an antagonist through this course, and it is an accurate statement. The menace is an antagonist. Now, it is not an antagonist as it is traditionally considered to be. The traditional definition of antagonists refer almost exclusively to characters, whereas the menace is a thought. The menace is a feeling. The menace is an atmosphere. It can be manifested by a character, and it will be the case for this course. The menace will always be a character, but the character is always a manifestation of a concept. For example, in a story where fatality is the main theme, the menace and the character which manifests fatality will be only a retranscription of this context. And through what the story displays as early as chapter 1 or 2, the menace will express herself through the setting, through the characters, through the items, through the dialogues, through the descriptions. Every single tool you can make use of to display what the menace is to be solicited. You can make use of any of these items depending on the level of subtlety you want to make. And that's why the menace is the zeroth point of view or the not point of view. The menace is either the starting part or the nothingness, because it is present in everything. The menace is present in everything in your story, and you may consider, and I'll address this to maybe a little more experienced writers, but for beginners, remember that the menace may directly be your story opposing the characters. The menace may be the theme itself, the story itself fighting the characters, and the characters will struggle before her. As the menace influence all the characters' action by the bias of their setting, their origins, and their future inclination, the characters influence each other. As presented earlier in the deep relationship, the antagonist may want to join the protagonist, but may not know how to do it. The antagonist may be willing to join the protagonist after a due event, a certain crisis, a betrayal, for example, from the menace. And the antagonist may be enticed by the supporter to join the protagonist. And that's the multiple ways through which the three main ways through which the antagonist may want to join the protagonist. And the protagonist may return the interest. She may be interested into acquiring a new valuable ally, because if the antagonist has trampled over her for so long, if she's such a powerful opponent, she can be a powerful friend. The support, of course, has a central role. You know, the support may be the most important discrete character, because the support will influence the protagonist's behavior and the antagonist's behavior, whichever support it is, again, because support here is considered as a function, the function of a mass. There can be one supporter in your story, 2, 3, depending on how much help your protagonist and your antagonist will need. Because remember, both the protagonist and the antagonist will struggle before the Menace. So they will need help, both of them, independently of their goal. The protagonists and the antagonists, so antagonist number 1 plus supporter and protagonist number 1 plus supporter, will face each other repeatedly because of the theme of the story, and they are likely to develop a long-term relationship, a sustainable relationship, except of course if most of them die through the story. But the remaining one, at the end of the story, the ones who haven't disappeared are highly likely to develop a sustainable relationship. So think about this duality between anta and prot, and think about how the supporter can entice it, can encourage it, and how the Menace can hinder it, while remembering that the supporter is an individual, it's a character, so she has her own interest. And if at some point, and it's a little bit advanced, but I want you to introduce to this concept, if the antagonist becomes, through the deep relationship, if the antagonist becomes the new protagonist, closest supporter, the support can turn into the new main antagonist. A character which was a main supporter before can turn into the main antagonist, because again, betrayal, she can feel betrayed by the protagonist, as we have discussed already in our protagonist's impact of the world and outer relationships structure. An ancient ally, if a new ally is added to the group, may feel that the main character, that the protagonist, has failed, and she will turn against her. Now we got functions. Let's go through roles.